Hi, and welcome to Season 2 of Eating Enlightenment. I'm your host, Jared Levinson, former binge eating wrestler turned Zen monk turned eating coach and counselor. Today we have a special guest, Heidi Schauster from nourishingword.com. Heidi has over 20 years of experience helping people heal from disordered eating, and she's written an amazing book, Nourish, How to Heal Your Relationship with Food, Body, and Self. Heidi's word of transformation today is nourish, and this word is going to help inspire you to heal and stop binge and emotional eating, as well as empower you to become a happier version of yourself. If you want more resources, check out eatingenlightenment.com for a free intro eating toolkit, as well as a quiz that will reveal your personal score on the emotional eating spectrum. Without further ado, let's talk with Heidi. What comes to mind when we're talking about healing a food relationship?
Well, I mean, the title of my book is Nourish. So I felt like if you were looking for a word that was a bit of a theme of what I might talk about, there's a reason why I chose that title and that word. Actually, my daughter chose the word. I was struggling with the title of the book, and it was this big long title, and she was reading like a one word book and was like, "Mom, one word, like stick with one word. Like, how about just nourish?" And I'm like, wow, brilliant. So my
That's
my preteen, I know, actually young teen daughter at the time. So who came up with the title. So
I love it. I love it. So nourish to you, like how would you define nourish?
well, when I talk about nourishment, like both in my book and also in my work, I'm obviously talking about nourishing ourselves with life-giving food, of
Mhm.
course, but I'm also talking about nourishment on lots of different levels, including, mental, spiritual, sensory, and many of us who've struggled
Mm.
with our relationships with food have struggled with that sense of full bodied, full soul nourishment. So I think nourish, the word nourish, I mean it on so many different levels, not just whether you're taking good care of yourself with food, but also are you taking good care of yourself in so many other ways.
Yeah. I just sent out an email yesterday about deprivation and how deprivation was like it could be physical deprivation, not eating enough, but also like the mental, emotional, spiritual deprivation. And I feel like nourish is the exact opposite of deprivation.
Sure. When we're well nourished, then we don't feel deprived. And yes, I mean, deprivation is something that many of my clients have a history of, whether it's actual food deprivation from being on lots of diets, or maybe even food insecurity in their lives in some way growing up. But it also could be emotional, uh, spiritual deprivation, not getting their basic needs met on an emotional level. And food sort of ends up being a way to sort of play that out, to sort of try to get their needs met, so to speak.
Yeah, and whenever I hear the word nourish, I feel like there's I mean, you got a plant, you got a couple of plants in front of you. Like that's funny that the image like comes to mind like your I don't know, like a plant just comes to mind for some reason when I think about nourish. What do you make of that? Like you have some
Well,
plants right there.
yeah, I mean, I'm a gardener, and I have lots of plants in my office. And now, while I'm like just doing Zoom from my confidential space in my basement, like during the pandemic, I try to put the plant, I have lots of plants in my office, but I'm trying to put plants here in my screen to just, it helps me sort of stay grounded to my own need for sensation.
Mm.
And it also like helps my clients to feel a little bit like they're at home in my office, so to speak. But I do think like plants, I mean, they're human beings, living beings. No, they're not human, but Sometimes I think they are, but they're living beings and they like require nourishment of the sun and rain and soil.
Yeah.
Like they require nutrients in the soil,
Hmm.
and they also have like I find weeding, for example, really therapeutic, where you're kind of clipping off and pulling out and removing sort of the dead, like not so useful parts of the plant so that new growth can
Uh,
spring forth. And I think as human beings, we're hopefully on our own journeys, we're doing the same thing. We're you know exploring parts of ourselves or parts of our histories that maybe don't make sense anymore or that we don't need anymore, and hopefully letting those go so that new parts, new experiences can come to be. So, and I think the recovery
Absolutely.
process, and like obviously I work with disordered eating. I think the recovery process in like in healing one's relationship with food and your body and yourself is a lot like that. It's like kind of exploring those outdated views about
Mm.
food, maybe outdated views about how to take care of yourself. Maybe they worked really well when you were young and in a traumatic situation, for example, and you needed to use food in a particular way to feel in control or to feel soothed, but maybe that's not so useful anymore, and sort of finding new ways to thrive.
Yeah, I love this analogy, this metaphor. I had a bonsai tree in college, and the bonsai tree you gotta clip like little snippets of the branches that come off, and then when you snip one branch, then another kind of flower or leaves can take its place, and it ends up kind of evolving into a different shape, and it's very conscious. I feel like trimming these old branches are so important for new growth to occur. And I like this nourish metaphor too, because when I hear nourish, I also hear this like I imagine like rainfall
Mhm.
coming gently pattering down on the plants, and the plants, or whether you've got a watering uh spout thing and you're pouring the water on. It's like this gentle pouring, but you do it every day. It's gentle. It's not that much, but it's kind of this like ongoing process of it's kind of gentle. You water your plants each day. I feel like that's how we nourish ourselves on so many different levels of food and all these different things.
Absolutely, Jared. I write about creating sustaining self-care practices in my book, and I didn't come up with that phrase myself. Wyoma, who is like a teacher of mine, actually coined that term, and I borrowed it and loved using it. This idea of like, what are the practices that you put in place in your day that are sustaining to you? And obviously, feeding yourself in a particular way might be part of that, but there's lots of other practices that are sustaining, and when we put those into place in our lives, whatever they are, they're very individual. For someone, it might be meditation. For someone else, it might be getting out in nature every day, whatever. But when you put those in place, then life falls into place, and also food falls into place often too, because then food isn't being used as like your only break, or this sort of the way
Mm.
you eat having to be perfect, for example, doesn't continue to have its hold because there are so many other practices in place that are meaningful.
Mm. And what are some practices that you resonate with? I love this idea of a sustaining self-care. That makes so much sense for a plant, right? Like we take care of the plant, we water it and put it in the sunlight and take it out of the sunlight when it gets too hot or whatever. And
Mhm.
how do you mentioned a few different levels. You mentioned food, you mentioned emotional, you mentioned spiritual. What are some different practices, some self-sustaining self-care practices that you do personally?
Mhm. Sure. Well, I have a busy day. I have a busy practice, and I have two teenagers who are still under my care, and I find that if I don't give myself some time in the morning, that's just for me, then my day gets away with me, and by the time the day is done, I'm just exhausted. And so I try to give myself time in the morning. And that's like a beautiful thing about teenagers is that they sleep in. So get quiet in the morning. Um, so in the morning, I try to use that time to I often water my plants, like my outdoor plants. If we haven't had rainfall, which there hasn't been as much of that this summer, and that grounds me to just be out taking care of my gardens. I have, vegetables and herbs and flowers. And then I usually use that time to move if I feel like movement. Some days I feel like rest, and some days I feel like movement. But I find that like if I want to go for a swim, I'll do that in the morning, or I'll do something physical, and then I'm usually, once I get any restlessness out of my body, if there is some, then I meditate and plan my day with intention. And that little, and sometimes there's writing. Well, there's almost always writing involved in my day, but I will, if I feel like there's something percolating within me and I need to do a little journaling, I'll use the morning for that too. And this changes. Like some days I do all of those things, and some days I only can do two of those things. But I try to capture some time for myself in the morning, and then I'm just better grounded and available to my clients and my kids and my friends and anyone else who needs me throughout the day.
Absolutely. And just curious, like when you are really busy and you don't have much time, like, and you said you only do like a couple of those things, like how long would you estimate on a really busy day that you spend doing these self-care things?
Yeah, I mean, there's certain non-negotiables, like breakfast is a non-negotiable part of my morning self-care. It's a little bit of meditation, even if it's just 5 minutes, is kind of non-negotiable for me because I have a really like active and sometimes anxious mind, and it really helps me settle.
Interesting.
But yeah, like it might just be an hour of my morning to take care of me.
Yeah.
Or it might be if I have a more spacious day, especially in the pandemic, now that I don't have to commute or like schlep anyone anywhere, it might be 3 hours, you know? It
Yeah.
might be 3 hours. I might sit down and do a big piece of writing, which maybe then eventually becomes an article or something. So it's like my self-care can actually inform my work too. But it
Absolutely.
really depends on the day.
And you mentioned this other powerful aspect of nourishing. I think people kind of get a gist for some of the self-care, sustaining self-care behaviors, and we can explore nutrition maybe a little bit later on. But you mentioned this like trimming. You mentioned examining these old branches that never serve you. I feel like this kind of process is less intuitive for people. It's kind of intuitive to nourish yourself with these different things, and it's important, and I love that you're bringing it up. How do you trim those branches from the past of old food behaviors and mindsets? How does someone kind of start to think about that?
Well, since you brought food into the question, we can talk about that specifically. Obviously, if I'm working with a client who has a long history of dieting or being encouraged to diet, or like a very prescriptive way of looking at food, where they're always looking at what does the latest health guru say I should eat, or what does the internet say I should eat, or what is my latest diet say. And they're very externally driven in terms of their choices around food.
Yeah.
Obviously some of the
Hmm.
work is going to be letting go of some of those myths and ideas about what foods are good and what foods are bad, and actually trying to realign and listen within a little bit more and make those decisions. And that can be super difficult,
Yeah.
because if you're always used to looking outside of yourself, or like kind of using your mind to make choices about nutrition, and you're not used to listening to your body and like asking like, well, what do I prefer, what does my body feel like right now, it can be very difficult.
Oh yeah.
It
it can
just
be,
takes practice.
it takes practice. Yeah. So a lot of people, it sounds like you're saying people kind of judge their success. They judge mentally their success. Like they're going for this feeling of like accomplishment, sort of like I followed the plan. I followed this person's advice, and it's all in their head, sort of. It's not maybe in their heart or gut, kind of. It's not in their body, so to speak.
It's not so connected. Yeah. It's not.
Yeah.
And I think we feel best. And, and I mean, this is just what I've learned over doing this work for 25 years. People feel best when they're eating in a very connected way, when
Mm,
they're like, they're in their bodies, they're listening,
mm,
they're following their own body's rhythms, they're like
mm,
listening to what their preferences are, and their hungers, and what their appetites are for, and they're paying attention to that. And it's very different kind of nutrition than I was trained for sure. Um,
interesting.
I mean, there's some nutrition education is important. And I think like knowing something about how to balance a meal can be helpful, especially if it's not intuitive for someone, or they've been really, trained away from like balance in their eating. But ultimately, like, I think it's exciting for someone to start listening to their body and noticing that it feels good to be eating in a really connected way.
Mm. Yeah, it feels good to be eating in a connected way. I feel like that represents just so much of I guess what a nourishing relationship will kind of lead you to, this connection to food and to just the whole experience. Where you mentioned something earlier too. I really appreciated. You mentioned sensory experiences.
Oh, sure. Yeah, well, food is like a super sensory experience, right? I don't think there's like anything else, except for maybe sex that like, gets all five senses going.
Ah,
Taste and, if you're eating something that crunches, there's a hearing element, touch. So all
mm,
those senses going when
mm,
we eat, and
mm.
lots of times, especially if we have a day where we sit in front of like a screen all day, it's almost like we're sensory deprived, right?
Yes, coming back to
Especially lately.
deprivation.
Yeah, yeah. And so food can be like a wonderful sensory break from sitting in front of a screen all the time. I know that like I get up from staring at Zoom for a chunk of time, and like, yeah, like obviously like there's a reason why food is appealing. Um,
Mm,
but I think we have to be careful that food isn't our only sensory reward or
yeah.
because then it takes on way too much, like it's way too charged. We need other sensory input throughout our day too, and so that's where those like self-care practices can come in, like getting
Mm,
outside and looking at the trees,
mm,
or
mm.
snuggling with a family member or a pet,
Interesting.
or having something soft around your shoulders,
Hmm.
or like having flowers like I have at my desk, or whatever it is that helps you connect with your senses on a regular basis, or like
Oh,
little nuggets, sensory nuggets,
yeah.
follow throughout the day.
I feel like we need these sensory things. Like we grew up in nature and we always had these senses coming in. And, like I feel that people, and myself included, like I'll forget that I need like variety of sensations. And I think like it's so important to recognize, sounds like you're saying, if we don't get these different sensations, it's almost like we're going to go automatically to food because we need these different sensations. We need these variety of experiences. And if we're just sitting at a computer all day, you know, no noise, the surroundings are bland, and there's no wind on our hair, there's no variety, we're going to be deprived, and we'll feel this compulsion to food to give us those sensations.
That definitely happens for some humans for sure.
Yeah, it's a
um,
part. So it can be a part
and it's
of. It can be a
natural, it
part
makes
of.
sense. I mean, yeah, it totally makes sense. um, Given that we all are sensory human beings. And some people I think are much more connected to their senses than
Mm.
others. Like some people need more sensory input than others.
Hmm.
And I think understanding that about yourself is important.
Hmm. Absolutely. And like this feeling connected and satisfied after a meal is, I feel like that might be one of the most important things about this whole thing, that nourishment leads to like satisfying, feeling satisfied within. I can imagine like the difference between like a plant that's a happy plant versus like a sad plant. That's what comes to mind when we're nourishing ourselves. We're filled up with life from within.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, food is one way that we have vitality, right? Like if we're eating regularly and eating, feeding ourselves like in a way that feels really connected to what our needs are, then we thrive, right? And it doesn't have to be so perfect. I think that's where the health and wellness industry sometimes can
Mm.
do us a disservice and make us think that it has to be perfect. I mean, if you're looking around the world, people thrive on lots of different kinds of cuisines. So
Mm.
um, it doesn't have to be so wonderful and perfect and clean and all the other adjectives that are used to describe our food. It just has to be aligned with what we want,
Mm.
and what our bodies needs are, which it can take some skill to get connected with. I think little kids do it really well, but as we get older, often we get disconnected from our appetites. But yeah, food is one way that we add vitality, but I think like you mentioned, there's lots of other ways that we add vitality to our lives too. And if we don't bring those into our life, then food can sometimes take on a greater role in
Absolutely.
that
I like
reward.
what you say too about like the whole clean and wellness thing, how it can be sort of perfectionistic.
Sure. Hmm.
Sometimes that you hear like eating clean and then the opposite is eating dirty, and there's this implication that one way is the right way, the other way is the highway.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, I mean, this is something I definitely write about a lot in my book. That idea of black and white thinking is really, I think it does us a disservice, because when we feed ourselves well, I think it's pretty gray, because
Yeah.
when there's a celebration and there's a wonderful birthday cake, it can be a gift and a very healthy behavior to celebrate with people around you and enjoy that cake, um,
Mm.
just as much as it can be very healthy to eat something that you pick fresh out of a garden. So I think we have to be careful about what we deem healthy and what we deem bad food, because all food can be good for us on different levels, as long as we're really listening to what we want.
And you had mentioned earlier that someone might, as they do these sustaining self-care practices, taking care of themselves, their like compulsion to, or their yeah, I'll say compulsion. I don't think you use that word, but what's coming to mind is that their compulsion to be really rigid around these rules would kind of decrease. That's how I understood a comment very early in the podcast. You said like, if someone is taking care of themselves, they won't feel this, I think, because their anxiety will go down. Like if they're taking some time for yourself, nourishing yourself, like getting grounded, then some of that, I feel like some of the anxiety will go down, and it won't be as much channeled into these rules, which I feel like these rules can help channel people's anxiety.
Sure. Yeah, I think, well, rules are like, they're comforting for some of us, right? Like
Yeah,
rules and
yeah.
routine can feel grounding. It can feel like, well, especially in this world today where there's like so much chaos and uncertainty with the pandemic, it can be like, it can be very like grounding to say, well, I don't know what's going on in my life right now, and there's so many things that are uncertain, but like my ducks are in a row around my diet. um like
Yeah.
I'm I know what I'm doing with my diet, and that feels grounding. And yeah, I think it can
Yeah.
become compulsive, or obsessive,
Yeah.
at times, because we're using food for that purpose. And you're
Mm.
right. It's like, I think when when we take care of ourselves in other ways, or when we maybe ground ourselves in other ways, let's say a regular meditation practice or something like that, then we may not need to use food so much to feel grounded or to feel um,
Yeah.
regulated, let's say.
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
yeah.
It seems so difficult at times. Do you have any I know you're big into acceptance and commitment therapy,
Hmm.
or do you have any words when someone is beginning to feel their body? Like you've mentioned that nourishment is a skill. You've mentioned that learning to listen to your body is a skill. I feel like when people when they hear these messages, sometimes they start to listen to their body, but it's like their body is, like a volcano has so much pressure that's been kept down. And when they start to feel that pressure within, they're like, oh shit, like there's a lot of darkness in there. There's a lot of pain. And like it's easy to become overwhelmed.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I'm so glad you brought this up, Jared, because I do think it's one of the things that's so hard about doing this work, is that helping someone to get connected with their body. Like, while that's a wonderful goal, it's not always easy or
Yeah.
or comfortable. I mean, it's often not comfortable for the people that I'm working with, to connect with their bodies. I mean, sometimes there's some trauma in their body that maybe they haven't even explored yet.
Yeah.
Sometimes being connected with their body brings up all kinds of self-loathing and criticism, and that doesn't feel good. So, it's almost easier to like cut ourselves off at the neck
Yeah.
and just live in our heads. But ultimately, with the right support, I do think people can move through that and get more integrated with themselves and with their bodies. It's just it requires work and lots of support.
Yeah.
Ideally, sometimes a good trauma therapist
Yeah.
uh, in the process. So yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
there's
I'm
a reason
reminded.
why eating disorders develop. I don't think it's just about our
Hmm.
awful diet culture. Otherwise, everybody would have eating
Hmm.
issues. And I do think there's a lot of them out there, but I think that, like, when the body has been um,
Hmm.
violated, or the body has been harmed in some way, or even emotionally there's some neglect,
Yeah.
that it can be really easy to split off from your body and not pay attention to it, and take care of everybody else's needs except for your own, for example. So really training people that it's not going to annihilate them if they listen to what they need, their own body needs, is challenging. It's a challenging part of this work, but it can be really, really, really amazing to see people shift and be able to trust their bodies, and respect their bodies, and connect with them a little bit
Oh
more. But
yeah. Like that's
often it's a
why
long process.
no, I bet it's so worthwhile. Like that's why, my journey's been a kind of emotional neglect. Not, yeah. So I had some. I still do. I still do have these kind of tendencies where I can, I neglect myself, and I can be outwardly oriented and not. Like my habits are to like be sensitive to others, but then like my internal can be ignored, and these wounds can go so deep, and and but coming back to the body, like that's been my journey, and so many other people's in this work, and it's so tough. I'm reminded just a couple of days ago I work at a eating disorder center in Half Moon Bay, and one client hasn't really gone to the bathroom that much because they're really struggling to get food in, and just seeing her struggle, like I mean terror about eating food, and like it just brought a tear to my eye. Like I'm like, damn, like this struggle to calm down around food sometimes, like whether your reaction to food is like fear and you're running away from food and anorexic tendencies, or your reaction is like the food takes you over and you get sucked into food. Like they're like staying grounded in those moments is so difficult. It is so tough to stay present in your body. And, I was talking to her like, hey, where are you right now? Like, it's like, I'm in the house, who's in the kitchen? Like kind of, cause those memories in the past, those tendencies can override your consciousness. And it's just so difficult to keep your consciousness in your body if food is pulling you or pushing you. So difficult, but it's so good to like have training to come back into your body. I feel like that's where you become more of a person. I feel like that's where you start reclaiming who you are and everything like that.
Absolutely. Yeah, and we have to have a relationship with food. Like, it's not
Yeah,
like,
that's true. It's
yeah,
you have to eat.
you
Yeah.
have to eat like several times a day. It's not, it's not, it's very different. Then people talk about it, food addiction, and I really have a problem with that term because, we we don't have to live with substances like alcohol or street drugs, but we do have to live with food. So it's a very different process. Even if you have some psychological addiction to some of what's going on in your response to food, it's a very different process to heal. And I think you're right, like having to really ground yourself in those moments and notice what's going on and notice what does your body really want right now, like what is your body really looking for. um,
Yeah.
there's, especially when there's fear or flooding or some other kinds of responses. And
And I think do you think that's why people say it's addiction, because they kind of get flooded and lose control, or?
well, I mean, I think that like we do have some evidence that you know the chemicals in the brain, that the reward centers light up when we eat highly palatable, yummy food. So I think what has happened is that the media has extrapolated that and said, well, then we can be food addicted. But psychological addiction and physical addiction are very different. We can be psychologically addicted to all kinds of things, like Facebook or whatever, um, all kinds of things we can like. And I think food we can have a psychological addiction to, and there is some physical need for food, but it's very, very different to heal from a problematic relationship with food, because you do have to face it multiple times a day. You do have to learn how to nourish yourself effectively with food. So it's a
Yeah.
much more complicated process. You can't just abstain
Interesting.
from food or abstain from certain foods. And I think I mean, I'm very biased. I will own, but it's based on 25 years of work in this field and seeing people really drop out of much more structured models to eliminate foods. And I just find that it just doesn't honor how complicated this process is and all the complicated feelings underneath that we tie up into our relationship with food.
Yeah. I feel I like what you said. It doesn't honor food. The word food addiction doesn't honor the complicated nature we have with food. I appreciate that. Um, yeah, it's messy and it's complicated, and we have to have food. There's something, what's it called? Disempowering? Not quite the right word, but yeah, disempowering, I guess. When you say it's when you're addicted to food, um, there's no like growth there, I guess.
Well, yes, there's that. Yeah, there's almost like, well, I'm powerless. And I actually don't believe that. I mean, I see client after client get more and more powerful in their lives. And so I don't believe in this stance that, well, I'm powerless against food or sugar or whatever. I think, as we get strong in ourselves, we learn how to make choices from a very conscious place, whether it's about what we're going to feed ourselves or how we're going to take care of ourselves in other ways. So um, I do think that recovery from challenges with food brings on a more powerful stance.
Absolutely. And I like what you said too, how you admitted or you acknowledged that like some food has kind of addictive qualities in the sense that it can activate those same brain centers that are, reward based. And, but that there's a big difference between like a different type of addiction where you don't necessarily need it versus food. And I appreciate that.
Yeah, it's complicated.
Yeah, it's
Our
complicated.
relationships with food are complicated, and they're complicated because, from day one, on this planet, the first time we were ever fed, food was intertwined with care.
Mm.
Um, so,
Yeah.
so yeah, like there's a reason why food is loaded and why we use food to manage challenges in our lives. It's very effective. It's soothing.
Mhm.
Um, yeah. So I think like helping people sort of explore
Oh, totally. That's what I do
all of
like
that.
all the time is like, what does food give you? Right? Like what are you getting from food, and helping people see like that food is helping them, numb, to escape, to get variety, to cure the boredom, to feel safe. It has a bunch of good things about it.
Mhm.
Temporary good things, but like there are very reasonable things that, why food can become so by magnetized by people that are magnetized towards food.
Yeah. Well, and it's on every street corner, and you know,
Yeah.
our culture. It's very plentiful
Mm.
and available and legal.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So there's a reason why we use it when we want soothing, or we use it when we
Mm.
want
Mm.
some kind of regulation or reward or downtime. Like there's a reason why it's effective, until it's not, until it ends up taking on a life of its own and feels like then it's compulsive or obsessive or turns into something else.
A tangent just came into my mind right now.
Yeah.
Is it necessary to have a goal to nourish yourself? Like, does someone need to have a future goal to nourish themselves? I don't know. Like if
um
someone wants to go nourishing, you know what I mean? Like if someone wants to start practicing nourishment, I feel like it can be easy to get off track or something. Like they're like to stick through the hard times. You mentioned this commitment, or you said non-negotiable. Um, like if someone wants to have these sustaining self-care practices, do you need like a goal in the future to work towards, where you kind of like, okay, I'm gonna commit to these self-sustaining behaviors so that I can reach my goal, or whatever, of whatever your goal is. I don't know, but maybe you don't need a goal. Maybe people, and I suppose it depends on the person.
yeah, I
What
think
do you, yeah.
I think I know what you're asking.
It's kind of a vague question. Yeah.
No, but I think what you're saying is, well, some people are ultimately very goal oriented in the way
Mm,
they operate,
hmm.
and that's fine. Like I
Mm,
think it's a temperamental thing ultimately, but no,
hmm.
I don't think you have to have a goal.
Mm,
I mean,
mm,
I think ultimately, if you want to sort of live your own best life, and a life that's meaningful to you in some way, and I'm not, who am I to say what's meaningful to any given person, um,
mm.
then aligning with things that are meaningful in your day and in your life is kind of critical.
Yeah.
Um, and I just find that when we're nourished on a basic level, and obviously there's like the basic level, you know Maslow's hierarchy of needs, like
Mm,
food, clothing, and shelter. When we get the food, clothing, and shelter kind of down, then like
mm,
we can move on to sort of feeling more fulfilled in our relationships, and then we
mm.
can move on to feeling more fulfilled in perhaps our careers, or and just feeling self-actualized in some way, like feeling connected to yourself as a real person and who you truly are. But I think like you do have to have some of those basic needs first. And if
100%.
someone is starving, for example, and they're not getting enough food on a regular basis chronically, it's very hard for them to sort of have success in all those other areas of their life. So for some of my clients, like their food recovery is moving them toward a goal of a more meaningful life. Um,
Mm.
Ideally, their food recovery is not moving them towards a goal that's like oriented around weight. That's not the way
Ah,
I operate.
that's a
Um,
good point.
uh, but like, the goal of perhaps feeling better in their bodies, or working the best, like, having their body sort of be as vital as it can be right now at the age and the stage they are in their lives.
Mm.
So I think you can
Yeah.
have a goal, but I don't know that you have to have
Oh,
some
no,
kind of
yeah.
goal, or that you're like working towards something in order to just take good care of yourself.
That's
um,
like such a good point. That is such a good point. What do you think about the word intuition? There's a lot of like intuitive eating, and I don't know. I've been trained in intuitive eating, but I hesitate prescribing myself to any system. I'm curious on your thoughts about the word intuition and so forth.
Yeah, well, I mean, I have intuitive eating as a framework in my work too. It's like one of many, like you mentioned,
Yeah.
acceptance commitment therapy. The book that I wrote has, a lot of those influences. And I think
Mm.
that, eating in an intuitive way can be really helpful and healing for a lot of people. It can also be super challenging for some. Not everybody is intuitive in the way they operate, and needs, like, sometimes they need to sort of build those skills. Um,
Yeah.
People are
Okay.
much more logically minded
Mm. Hmm.
than others, and actually do better with some kind of system or structure um, for themselves. And
Yeah.
I think everybody's a little bit different. So yeah, I mean, I
Mm.
believe in the intuitive eating principles, and I believe that they can really help people to connect more to themselves. But I think it doesn't, obviously it doesn't work for everyone in
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
exact same flavor.
Yeah. Hmm.
Everybody has to come to nourishing themselves in the way that works for them. And some people just don't connect very well with their bodies, maybe
Yeah.
because of trauma or whatever. And so in the meantime, as they're doing some of that work to integrate a little bit more, they might need a little bit more structure in their eating.
Yeah, like that's been one of my key realizations over the past maybe last few years or so. But like, it's not all about intuition. It needs to. Sometimes I talk about like yin and yang, and the yin is the intuition and flow and body connection, and then the yang would be like the structure. And I'm realizing there's got to be some structure, especially for some beginning folks who are just starting to feed themselves more and to have this sort of regular rhythm with food. And that brings me to, like, as we kind of start to wrap up today, you mentioned this starving thing, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where if you're not eating enough, it's going to be really hard to be fulfilled and nourished in all these other areas of life.
Sure.
For me, I I can't help but feel like starvation or not eating enough, not getting enough. I feel like that's the root of like whether you're binge eating, whether you're bulimic, whether you're anorexic, whether you're not fully an eating disorder but just struggle with food. I feel like it always comes down to not eating enough. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I totally agree with you.
Okay, sweet, sweet, sweet.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have this like messed up idea in our culture that, like, somehow eating less is a good thing.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and that, like, our bodies are better if we eat less. And I mean, and there's a lot of, you can see it all on the internet, right? Dieting has been around for a long time, and it's a $60 billion industry, and it's based on the fact that it doesn't work. And so people will keep coming back for the next product or pill or book or whatever. So I think there's a reason why we have these like beliefs in us. And also, like, I think we have a lot of misinformation. Like, I find that teenagers who are growing and athletic have absolutely no clue how many calories they need, for example.
Mhm.
Not that, like, I talk with them about calories or numbers, but like, if you're growing and you're active practicing a sport every day, um, like, it's a tremendous amount of food. There's a reason
Mm,
why you should be eating your family out of house and home.
mm.
And instead of, like, parents getting all upset because their kids are like going nuts on junk food, like maybe it's just a growth spurt.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, I do think like
Huh. Uh,
we get very like caught up in
eating less.
how, like eating the right way, and I think under eating can lead to making food more charged than it needs to be, and then that can often lead to binge eating, as you
Mm,
mentioned. So,
yeah,
and it becomes a cycle. So,
yeah,
and this idea, you mentioned deprivation earlier in this interview, like, this idea of feeling deprived, like thinking that you don't have enough of something that's really vital, very vital, it's a basic need,
mm,
can really set off your brain to feel very charged about food.
mm,
So,
mm.
so yeah,
Yeah,
I do think
yeah.
that's often the case. I know
Uh,
from my own history, I had no concept that, like, as a very active young dancer, that
mm,
like I needed to eat quite as much as I needed to eat.
mm.
It wasn't really until later when I started studying nutrition that it like kind of opened my eyes to like, wow, like I need to eat a lot more than I thought. But I grew up in the 70s and the 80s and the Diet Pepsi land. So I think, yeah, I think we have a lot of misguided information about how much food is adequate.
Yeah, yeah, that's such a good point. You're probably under eating a lot. I mean, see it a lot, and I wrestled in high school too, and that was all about under eating, and it's just out there to under eat, and there's this tremendous fear of weight gain and obesity, and so I feel like a lot of people they try to manage their weight by under eating, and then it backfires, and then it starts off this negative cycle, and then like people give up on themselves, and it's
Agreed.
really not good, this whole like eating less thing. It is not nourishing at all. It is not nourishing.
No, it just
It is
creates
not
that
nourishing.
deprivation, like you said,
Yeah, yeah.
both on a physiological level, but I think also on an emotional level, because
Hmm.
food is really about care. It's really about
Mm,
taking care of ourselves, and some like,
mm,
and when we're young, somebody else takes care of us and feeds us, and then eventually we take over that
mm,
job and we feed ourselves. So
mm.
it is representative of care. So it kind of hits us on a heart level as well as a physiology kind of level when we're not
Yeah,
when we're not eating enough.
you mentioned earlier that food, we when we were first born, food and care were what was given to us, and really feel this from you right now. Like care is this part of nourish. I mean, it's like, it's part of nourishing, this care, and food and care and everything. They're like, intertwined. Care. I love that word, care. Yeah. Oh, think we, oh,
I hope that you got that
I
on your
gotta,
recording.
yeah, yeah, yeah. We're still
But
here. We're
you
still
were
recording.
saying something profound and then you froze on my screen.
You froze my screen too.
Okay.
I'll cut this part out later.
But
But
I
I
think
think that's a good cue to wrap up, I guess. I feel like that's pretty good.
yeah, I just missed that what you were saying about care. So,
I was
and it
just probably
seemed
going on some
profound.
like philosophical tangent. Care is what, intertwined with nourish and stuff like that. I kind of,
Okay, yeah, well, we take care of ourselves with food, but it's only one way that we take care of ourselves.
yeah, and I feel like that mindset of that food can help take care of ourselves is different than what a lot of people are used to hearing. Like, I think people are used to thinking about food as like, I don't know, what's the word? I don't quite have it off the tip of my tongue. Like this, kind of like a homework assignment, kind of like a pass fail test type of thing. I feel like that's what a lot of people's relationship to food is. It's not like, what's food doing for me? It's like, I have to obey food, but it's not like food is taking care of me. Um,
Right. Now, well, there's more of a sort of self-control oriented um, relationship with food as opposed to self-care. And I think we have the same
Yeah.
problem with movement. I use the term movement in my book instead of exercise because I just think exercise is like a loaded term for a lot of people. But like, it's natural for us all to want to need to move. But again, like we have this sort of prescriptive relationship often with exercise that says, okay, well, I'm going to check off my box. I did it today, as opposed to like what does my body feel like doing in this exact moment? Okay, I have 10 minutes. Like, does my body feel like stretching? Does my body feel like walking? Do I feel like lying down? Like movement can also be something that we relate to in a caregiving kind of way, as
Yeah.
opposed to a prescriptive way.
Yeah, and I feel so much that when you check in with your body, like as you say, I feel like you do things differently. You move differently, you check in with
Mhm.
your body, it feels good to you. And I feel like this kind of checking in and seeing how it feels in your body, that leads to this, yeah, this inner growth, like this vitality.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Mhm. I love it. Um, so you have a awesome book out where the title of the book is Nourished: How to Heal Your Relationship with Food, Body, and Self.
Correct. Yep. You got it.
Links will be down below. Heidi, where can people find you online?
Well, my website is a nourishingword.com. So it's a nourishing word.com. And I have a blog there. I usually send out a seasonal newsletter with nourishing nuggets here and there. And I run groups for people who are working on their journey, as well as for dietitians, nutritionists who are practicing in the field of disordered eating. I do
Hmm,
supervision and consultation groups as well. So, yeah,
cool.
that's where you can find me.
Quick question. Was the nourishing, you mentioned your daughter gave you the nourish word. Or did she give you the nourish word? Like, did you come up with the book and then the nourishing website after the book?
Well, no, actually, my practice has always been like nourishing words, nutrition therapy. So yeah, I've used that word before it was the title of my book. But she's the one who said, "Mom, like one word
Ah,
title,
one
keep it
word.
simple." Which I thought was
Okay, got you,
great
got
advice.
you. Yeah, and the last question I always ask people is like, what has been your personal biggest eating enlightenment, your biggest like shift in perspective around food for you personally?
Wow, for me personally, well, I think it's a little bit about what we talked about. For me personally, I think my aha moment, which like turned my whole life around in terms of obviously what I did with my career and working in this field, was realizing that, um, if in order to be an active, vital, rambunctious human being, I needed to eat plenty and enjoy
Mm,
it.
mm,
And so once I started doing that, and like my life just felt so much more gratifying on so many levels, and energized, I wanted to share that with others, which is why I studied, nutrition, and then went on to do eating disorders work.
mm,
So yeah, that idea that food it really is life on some level. It's like
mm, mm.
um, yeah, like that food is life giving on so many levels.
Amen. Thank you so much for coming on. Namaste. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it, Jared. This was fun.
Great. I'm trying to make it fun. Yeah. Namaste. Thank you, thank you, thank you so much for listening. I am filled with gratitude and I am so appreciative. If you're appreciative as well for what you heard in this episode with us today, then please leave a 5-star review. It really helps get the word out for other people who need to experience an eating enlightenment for themselves. Finally, for further resources, visit eatingenlightenment.com for a free intro eating toolkit to stop binge and emotional eating. At eatingenlightenment.com, you'll also see a free quiz option that will give you a personal score on the emotional eating scale so that you know whether you're a stress eater, an emotional eater, compulsive eater, etc. And it also lists the 13 different criteria for binge eating disorder. So visit eatingenlightenment.com and namaste. Stay tuned for another episode coming soon.